because, as you probably know, the internet, the blogosphere, it's called, in China, on foreign issues, can be roused to extremes of nationalism. And it's to that audience that these people are playing. I think, however, that they are licensed in the sense that they could be shut up tomorrow. You know, a general could be told, you know, you're going to lose your car, you're going to lose your apartment, just shut up. But they don't tell them that, because I think it's useful for implicitly the leadership to say, we've got some toughies out there. They don't want to, you know, push us too far because the toughies are there. So I think there is a hidden motive in allowing those people to speak. The People's Liberation Army is an important issue, and the control of it was to Mao the most important thing in his power. When it seemed that Lin Biao could also control the People's Liberation Army, he was eased out and finally fled the country. And of course, the People's Liberation Army does not like, no army in the world likes the idea of firing on their own people. The reputation you get for firing on your own people is not a good one. And that's what happened in Tiananmen. And only someone like Deng Xiaoping and his immediate colleagues with their revolutionary reputation could have ordered that and had the order obeyed. And so I think the issue for the leaders to come, as it has been for Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, is can we make sure, and there are always articles saying you've got to be loyal to the party, can we be sure that the party, that the army will obey us in a real crisis? Or will it say, we've had enough trying to pick the chestnuts out of the fire for the party, it's just too long that we've done this? I think on balance, probably the inertia prevails. The party will continue to tell the army what to do, and the army will continue, as long as it gets money for toys and so on, will continue to genuflect in the general direction of Zhongnanhai.
I would agree. I think the only problem is there's a certain inevitability. When you stake out claims, say to the South China Sea, that 30 years ago were sort of irrelevant because you didn't have anything more than coastal craft, so you couldn't really enforce your claim, that big sort of sack that goes down to all the countries in Southeast Asia, that it didn't really matter that you had these claims. Now you have these claims, and you're modernizing your military, throwing lots of money, building an aircraft carrier, you'll build another aircraft carrier. There becomes a certain inevitability. Well, if we really have this claim, if this is really our territory, then we have to defend it. And now we have the means to defend it. I mean, I don't mean now, this year, but sometime down the road there will be the means. And there are already some sort of conflicts with the Philippines and some other countries that still are a lot of posturing, and things haven't resulted and aren't close to any sort of violence. But you could see that as the military force grows, that there could be a real potential. And I think that it may not be in 5 years, but at some point down the road, China will have to either compromise, but the more that they print all the maps, all have this claim, it's staked out there, and military people tend to be say, hardliners when it comes to defending national soil. So I don't know what will happen in the longer term. I'm not quite so sure. I think they will stay under party control in the foreseeable future, but if the politicians no longer back these positions, there may be pressure to say, well, we want to have a general on the standing committee, because we don't think you are representing our interests, the interests of China, defending Chinese sovereignty and territory, the sacred mission of any Chinese government, especially after the 19th century. We don't think you're doing it. Right now they are, but in the future it's hard to know. So that's why when China declares, as they've done, they declare core interests. They've kept ratcheting up what's a core interest.
It's very dangerous. There's no backtracking.
Yeah, because at that point, you essentially have locked yourself into this position, especially with the military, I think.
Well, the Chinese had actually been playing Southeast Asia extremely well until about 3 years ago, when they started to become tougher on these claims in the South China Seas with Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries also have claims. And with the possibility of mineral deposits, petroleum, whatever, this becomes important. It's more than just an issue of history. But I think that the Chinese civilian leadership has to decide, are we going to get into a situation where, because of these claims to these tiny rocks, which we could jointly explore and recover our reputation with Southeast Asia, are we going to do that, or are we going to keep pressing, as some of the military might like us to do, the result of which will be what we keep saying we don't want and what we fear, namely a de facto or actual alliance between America, Japan, Australia, India, and anyone else who wants to throw their hat into the ring against Chinese expansionism.
I think that's the logical outcome, but the problem, and here you get to the change in the nature of the leadership over the decades, you have a leadership by consensus. You no longer have the big dominant person like a Deng who could...
Or a Bo Xilai.
Or a Bo Xilai, who could push through something, who could make a historic compromise and say, yeah, that's all our territory, but actually we're not going to really enforce it. We're going to cut a deal with these countries and do that. That takes a lot of political capital, takes a lot of courage. And at least the past 10 years has been a leadership without much courage. It hasn't exhibited much courage on any tough issues at all. So does the new guy have the wherewithal to do that? That's sort of the big question. But these questions, it's not just in foreign policy, it's also economic and so on and so forth. They require some kind of an icebreaker type personality who can cut through all these competing interests.
It's a paradox, isn't it? Because I think China had its dose of big leaders.
Right. Who wants to
and actually the West had had a dose of big leaders. And now China has gotten rid of its big leaders, and it ends up with this kind of treacly government that can't make big decisions, and we have a certain nostalgia for that kind of breakthrough ability.
After Stalin and Khrushchev, you had Brezhnev.
Yes, well, that's true. But we don't see any sign, at least till now, that China is going to have a new big leader culture anytime soon.
Well, no one thought Khrushchev would be.
Yeah. Okay, let's move right along. Here's from the web. I have read about China introducing somewhat democratic elections for local party officers some years ago and thought it might be the basis for a slow, controlled rollout of democratic principles. Is this evolutionary process continuing? How far along is it?
I think the answer is it has not been rolled out much further than it was in the late 90s, early 2000s. There were experiments, or more than experiments, with village democracy, where you would have, let's say, 5 positions and 7 or 8 candidates. You have, the key is to have more candidates than positions, obviously, and that way the people, but I'm not saying multi-party democracy, just FYI about democracy. The key is, of course, that way you can, if you got a really bad, corrupt SOB in there, you can say, okay, well, he's not one of the, he's the 6th person or the 7th person, he's not one of the 5 who gets elected. And that was a safety valve, but it was an interesting safety valve. It was an interesting effort, but it sort of stayed in the nascent stage, and you do have elections, but they tend to be sort of one position, one...
The lowest levels.
Yeah, at the lowest levels. And there were experiments, I think in Sichuan, there was one county where they were where they wanted to have these elections. That would be the next level up, or a township, I guess maybe it was a township in Sichuan. And then,
where there's real power.
Yeah, where there's real power, rather than just the village. But that didn't go anywhere. Mm-hmm. But of course, this is one of the Taiwan models.
But the attitude, I mean, I went to a conference run by, many years ago, run by the Ministry of Civil Affairs, which was in charge of village democracy. And there were a very idealistic group of people who really wanted democracy and saw this as the beginning. And, but they had a certain view of how democracy should be run. It's exactly what Ian's saying.
Should be run, that's...
Yeah, the point was, I explained to them that in Britain, or in America for that matter, any crook could run for election, and provided he or she got the votes, they would be elected. Whereas there were much more Confucian. You select a couple of candidates, both well-educated, relatively speaking, both as honest as you could find, and they had a choice between two good candidates. No crooks need apply. This was very much controlled.
Sounds like a pretty good system, right? Okay, question right there in the back.
That gentleman on this side is trying to get out.
You've spoken of the relationship between the rulers and the ruled and the stresses in that relationship. Would you like to say anything about the relationship between rich and poor and the growing inequality and class consciousness?
It's the same thing.
I was going to say back to the rulers and the ruled.
Yeah, because I think you're right. There's a huge income disparity, by all accounts, the largest in the world or largest of a major country in the world.
And the gap is widening.
And the gap is widening. And you have, that's why I think change in China is most likely to come from below. I have very little confidence in the elites, because I think the elites have been mostly bought off. So all the super rich in China, all the people who are engaged in interesting things at the super top levels of society, entrepreneurs and so on, I don't hold out much hope for them changing things, because I think they have gained stupendously over the past couple of decades.
Would you please wait a minute, sir? Please wait a minute. Continue.
Yeah, well, I think that's the main thing. So I think there's a huge issue that hasn't really been addressed.
What I think is the case is that, sort of like in the West to some extent, is that you are much more concerned if your neighbor has got a higher income or more wealth than you, especially if you assume that that wealth has been attained illegitimately. And you don't sort of see, you don't have the movie magazines quite in the same number as you do here. You don't see the rich every day parading in front of you, because one thing, at least as far as I can tell, is that they like to keep their wealth quiet. Now, it is true that Forbes, I think, has listed some of the Chinese billionaires, so they're well known perhaps outside more than inside China. But so far, there hasn't been. The Bo Xilai case, for instance, has not brought widespread anger about the riches which people in high positions can accumulate for themselves and their families. But if this kind of thing continues, then that might be a serious problem for the leadership. How to justify the fact that they or their relatives have these vast amounts of money under their control.
And interesting, this is, of course, where the revolution began against the Kuomintang. The nationalists was, to a certain degree, rich against poor.
In some ways, though, China's in some ways like the United States, because there's this huge gap in the United States, but there's this national myth or story in the United States that if I work hard enough I can get ahead, I can become the next Bill Gates, or I can send my kid to Harvard or whatnot. And in China, this is not as deeply embedded, let's say, in the national consciousness. But I think over the past 30 years, there has been this feeling of all boats are rising. Things are a lot better than they were in the past. And so that makes people perhaps less resentful of the super rich, because they think they can get ahead. Whether this continues or not, I don't think the growth will be as strong in the future as it has been in the past. So that could lead to resentment.
All right, we have time for one more question right here. Yes, second row.
You've given us a great sense of the social forces and social tensions that are swirling around China. But I wonder if you can, it almost sounds as if the party is a kind of unified force, and I wonder if you can talk about the party and what's going on behind the scenes there. Presumably there are going to be a lot of negotiations in Beidaihe this summer before the change of leadership in the fall, and I wonder how split the party is, what are the factions, and is there kind of a reform, so-called reform faction versus a more conservative faction. Can you talk about the party situation? Thanks.
Let me say something about that. Before I do, let me just say one thing. You mentioned the corruption under the Kuomintang. A very senior Chinese official, retired, former chief editor of the People's Daily, told me about 10 years ago, corruption is worse today, this is the 90s, than it ever was under the Kuomintang. And he was alive at that time and knew it. I think the problem with the party at the moment, in my view, is that they've reached the end of the line of the institutional reforms which Deng Xiaoping instituted. Deng Xiaoping basically got them to agree 2 terms and up or you're out. And he basically got them to agree, there are always exceptions, 70, you retire, no office for life. What he didn't do was to change the method of selection of the leader. Mao chose 4 successors, and none of them lasted. One survived him, but didn't last. Deng Xiaoping also chose 4 successors. 2 didn't last, but he blessed Jiang Zemin and he blessed Hu Jintao. End of the line. There is no legitimation procedure for the Chinese communist leader. And I think that one of the dangers that Bo Xilai, a thruster, if ever there was one, charismatic from what one can tell, posed for the Chinese leadership, was that if he was in the Politburo Standing Committee, as he clearly wanted to be and felt that he'd made the case for himself to be, then he could have been a challenge to Xi Jinping, who does not seem to be as charismatic, as high profile as Bo Xilai was. And one of the reasons for being able to challenge him is because he arose as a result of a backdoor deal. Nothing official, nothing transparent. He wasn't, in fact, supposedly the first choice of Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao did not have the clout to choose his successor, nor did Jiang Zemin. And so what you have in the party at the moment, which is a fundamental issue, is the lack of legitimacy in any recognizable sense by the institution itself of the leadership. Now, when you add to that the issues of should we have political reform, as Ian said earlier, poor Mr. Wen Jiabao, the Prime Minister, has been talking about that for years. I think he wants his place in history because nothing has happened, but maybe one day it will and people will remember. But there are people who want political reform, at least at a slow pace. There are others who regard it as absolutely the worst thing that could possibly happen to the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, if the General Secretary who comes in October or November came into the Politburo Standing Committee or the Politburo one day and said, comrades, I've had an idea. Let's try democracy. He'd be out. I mean, there are 18 million people whose privileges, perks, income, wealth, corruption depends on being a member of the Communist Party. It's a wonderful Rotary Club to be a member of. And so I think there are many other problems with the party, but I think the fundamental one is that they have not got their act together institutionally, so that in October, when the Party Congress meets, everyone will say that Xi Jinping has been chosen as a result of a process which I recognize. Laying on of hands by Deng Xiaoping or Mao Zedong may not seem much, but it was very important, and Xi Jinping doesn't have that.
Ian, last word.
Well, I think to answer your question also about other factions, there are factions in the party, but I don't think it's as clear as in the past, where you could say there's a reformist wing and there's a conservative wing and so on and so forth. I think there are a lot of different interest groups. It's become very complex, some people supporting large state-owned enterprises and so on and so forth. That also creates this logjam, that it's harder to negotiate all of these interest groups that are clogging up the system. Sounds kind of like the United States.
I was thinking the same thought.
I don't think you'll see that kind of a division, or the top is certainly not ribbon. I don't think of the 9 or 7 people, however many are in the Standing Committee, 3 are on one side, 4 on the other, or anything like that. There are people in the party who are very pro-reform and very outspoken, and there are 80 million party members, so you do have people who are in favor of democracy in the party. But by and large, those people don't have a voice, and it's, in a way, it's kind of like the mafia. I mean, to get to the top of it, you're not going to be advocating democracy and that sort of thing. So I don't see the current leadership making any fundamental changes. There is a case to be made that Xi Jinping might have a bit more clout because he's a princeling, the son of a revolutionary veteran. He might have a bit more of a power base. He's got good ties to the military. People had made similar arguments a decade ago about Hu Jintao. So I would be very cautious. I think there's always a lot of optimism at this time of year. As new leaders are coming in, let's hope they're better than the old ones, and here's my case why it should be. I don't mean to be pessimistic. I just don't think people really know very much. He's never made any programmatic statement. He's never come out in favor of anything, and that's why he got where he is, right? Because he's a cipher.
And it's interesting, even after 10 years in office, Hu Jintao has never really revealed himself.
Yeah, what does he stand for? Yeah.
It's an interesting.
He stands for himself remaining in power.
And the party
stability.
remains.
I mean, that's been his keyword. Stability, harmony, those kind of things.
Well, listen, gents, thank you for coming. It's been very nice to have you.
We're not going to be attacked by the gentleman you didn't recognize.